Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm Stephen Pfeiffer. I'm a William Perry Fellow here at the Center for International Security and Cooperation, and it'll be my pleasure to introduce and moderate today's event, which is being co-sponsored by the European Security Initiative Series, but also by the Center for Russia, East European, and Eurasian Studies. Russia's ability to pose a challenge to Europe and the West is going to depend in part on the performance of the Russian economy. And there are certain obvious ways that works. To the extent that the Russian economy is doing well, Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin have more resources for the Russian defense budget. And we've in fact seen that budget go up over the course of the last 10 years. But the performance of that economy also has other implications. One would be, does it provide enough that Mr. Putin can spread the wealth among his cronies to maintain loyalty to the Kremlin? A second question is, does it provide enough to meet the popular expectations of the Russian people? And if it doesn't, that does raise some questions. Do you begin to see a level of disaffection arise among the populace? And I think there's some evidence of that, but I'll defer to Anders on that question. And you have a situation where the Russian economy really prospered for about 8 years from 2000 to 2008 during Mr. Putin's first 2 terms. And that was in part because he was really lucky. About a year after he became president, the price of oil went up and had a huge effect on the Russian economy, which then grew about 7% a year. However, since Mr. Putin came back to the presidency in 2012, the economy has not done so well. And over the past 5 years, it's really been stagnant. It's grown at about 1.5% a year. And looking out to the future, most projections by economists are that it's not going to do much better than that. And the kinds of changes that I think Mr. Putin would have to make to the economy that would allow the economy to grow at a faster rate really would come into contradiction with this model of crony capitalism that we've seen develop in Russia, about which we're going to hear. And I think that's also very closely linked to the authoritarian model that Mr. Putin has pursued over the last 15 years. So I am delighted that we have today with us Anders Åslund to talk about this question. He has leading expert on post-Soviet economies, East European economies. He's a prolific writer. His latest book is right there if you'd like to get it. I highly recommend it. He holds a PhD from Oxford. He's now a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University in Washington. And he's advised a number of governments in the post-Soviet space on economic reform and economic change. And that also includes the Russian government, when the Russian government was a little bit more receptive to such advice. So Anders, thanks very much for joining us. We look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you, Mike and Frank. It's a pleasure to be here at Stanford again. And this is the 4th book that I'm writing about Russian economy. I take a period and see what has been accomplished. My first book was after I worked as a Swedish diplomat in Moscow, 1984 to 87, Russia's struggle for economic reform. My 2 that came out in 1989. I had 2 points in that book. The first is that Gorbachev is really reforming the Soviet economy. This is not old-style socialism. And the other point was that this won't work. The system will collapse, and collapsed it did. So then, happily, I engaged with a new reformist government and worked as an economic advisor together with Jeffrey Sachs and David Lipton for Yegor Gaidar and Boris Yeltsin, 91 to 94. And after that, not entirely happy experience, but still a lot was accomplished. I published the book in 1995, How Russia Became a Market Economy. After that, it was a lull, and then it didn't turn also pleasant, in spite of tremendous economic growth in the early 2000s. So I published the book, Russia's Capitalist Revolution, somewhat inspired by Mike McFaul's title, Russia's Incomplete Revolution. or Unfinished Revolution, and with a subtitle, Why Market Economy Succeeded and Democracy Failed. Now we have come a bit further. So now my title, as you see, is much more pessimistic. Russia's crony capitalism, the path from market economy to kleptocracy. And my big point today is that Russia is an authoritarian kleptocracy, and that Putin primarily combines two things. The secret police that you all know about, and then what I think is strongly underemphasized, organized crime. Putin was heavily involved in organized crime in the early 1990s in Saint Petersburg. Putin was then first deputy mayor of Saint Petersburg, responsible for international investment. And this is exactly where you had the worst criminality. You can hear many American businessmen who dealt with Putin at the time, and they said that Putin was the only person we dealt with in St. Petersburg at the time who did not hold out his hand and ask for bribes. But that doesn't mean that he was honorable. It only means that he concentrated on the big bribes. He concentrated on raiding 2 hotels. He focused on the oil trade. He took over, together with one of his cronies, the big oil refinery in St. Petersburg, and of course the port and the telecom company. So why bother about the small thing if you concentrate on the big thing? So the big point I want to leave you with is that we can't understand Putin well if we don't know that he's rooted in organized crime. So let me show you one single graph that I think says what we really need to know about Putin's economics. During Putin's first 9 years, average economic growth was 7% a year. You can't do much better than that. But the point is that Putin arrived at the late table. To begin with, he could benefit from the Gaidar, Yeltsin reforms in the 1990s that came to fruition actually after the financial crash of '98. And there was then a lot of free capacity to utilize. And after that, from 2003, we have the oil boom. So I would not give Putin much benefit of this. And then in the second period, which is often missed, is that now we have seen 1 decade of Russia having 1% average growth a year, which is miserable. You can't blame oil price, sanctions, war for a whole decade. This means simply that Putin has chosen kleptocracy over national strength and welfare. My point is simple. Putin does not care about economic growth, and he doesn't care about the welfare of his people, and of course he's not interested in making Russia great again. He's interested in image building, and that he does very well. So let me stop with this picture for a little while, because as I see Putin's role, and this is how I structured the book, it is with 4 circles. The first circle is what Putin built up during his first term, 2000 to 2004. And I would say that this was probably the happiest time for Russians for a long time before or after. This was a period when Putin was everything to all people. That is what you should do if you want to consolidate power. This was good politics. He started with FSB, the old KGB. Immediately after he came in, got administrative control, and got Alexei Kudrin to sort out the state finances, but also heavily centralized them. And in 2002, a big judiciary reform, which at the time looked good. It did most of the things that we wanted to be done in the judiciary, but there was one important hang-up. He moved the power of the judiciary from the regional governors to the presidential administration. And that's what we later realized. And we realized it fully on one day, the 25th of October 2003, when Mikhail Khodorkovsky was arrested. Then the wealthiest man in Russia, and you can say the most independent big oligarch. What Putin effectively did is that he started a war on the oligarchs. And he did it cleverly. He focused on the most important oligarch. Nobody followed Khodorkovsky. What it also meant was that during Putin's second term, he built up a second circle of power, which was the big state corporation, with Gazprom being the prime one, then the various military industrial companies, and Rosneft, which took over most of the assets of Yukos. And then in Putin's third term, when he was only prime minister, but he was the real power also then, Putin did the opposite. He went for asset stripping, stripped the state companies of asset and transferred the money to his friends that I will come to. And then we come to the fourth circle of his power that is missed out. And that's the Anglo-American offshore. Where is Putin's wealth held? I would suggest that probably most of it is held in this country. Russian private wealth abroad is $800 billion. Probably 1/3 to 1/4 belongs to Putin and his friends. And this is then hidden in layers of shell companies. And we don't know where it is. This country alone has more than 2 million anonymous companies. But let me come back to this. So a counter-argument. Hasn't Putin done any reforms? Yes, he has. He has greatly improved the functioning of a Russian state administration. And in 2012, the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index caught his interest. And Russia at that time was on 120th out of 180 countries. Today, it's the 31st. What this means is that administrative routines are much easier. Russia does not have worse administration than the US in general, that it is now heavily computerized and functions pretty well for ordinary citizens. But Russia is as corrupt as it has been for the last decade, according to the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International. So my conclusion from this is that Putin wants good administration, and he also wants corruption that works for him and his buddies. So when I was working in Moscow in the early 90s, I had the sense that corruption looked like this. There was a lot at the bottom. Everybody wanted something, but there was little at the top. There were many top officials at the time still who were honest. Then gradually changed like this. And now I think that it looks like an atomic mushroom, where we have all the corruption, the real corruption at the top, and rather little left for the ordinary people lower down. So let me then discuss a little bit about how much money we are talking about. The pioneering work here was by my late good friend Boris Nemtsov and Vladimir Milov, who is now one of Alexei Navalny's deputies. They published a booklet in 2008, Putin and Gazprom, and they assessed that Putin and friends had taken out from Gazprom $60 billion in 4 years, $15 billion a year. How do you do it? First, asset stripping. So Putin's friends took the construction companies, finance companies, media companies, petrochemical companies, all kinds of non-core assets, and bought them extremely cheaply since Putin controlled the Gazprom management. And then they did services for Gazprom, in particular building pipelines for Gazprom. Gazprom has about twice as large trunk pipelines as it needs. Then they did similar things in the rest of the economy, and they continue to do the same thing with Gazprom. And for example, right now, the main pipeline construction companies are being bought back by Gazprom, of course at a high price, so that Putin's friends can get a good price. Gazprom Bank has been privatized and renationalized 3 times. So Gazprom sells cheaply and it buys at a very high price, because the purpose of the company is to produce money for the friends. And the total outflow, by my assessment, is $15 to $25 billion since Putin really got the machinery going in 2006. So that gives us a total outflow of $200 to $320 billion, with total Russian private holdings abroad, probably $800 billion. Others put it at 1 trillion or even higher. How much belongs to Putin? My assessment is $100 to $160 billion. This is privately held funds abroad in anonymous companies that have been taken out. The basis for this is a chap called Sergei Kolesnikov, who was a junior partner in 32 offshore companies in which Putin was involved. And his big mistake was that he wanted to retire. You don't retire in this business. So he then was afraid that he would be murdered. So in 2010, he fled Russia, and he lives now in Estonia. And he is has spilled the beans in a number of interviews, in particular in 2012. So the picture he gives is that Putin has specific ownership shares in each company, but it varies from company to company. So roughly half to a senior partner, half to Putin, and then a few percent in the middle to the manager who actually did the job, people like Sergei Kolesnikov. And then in the Panama Papers that Putin, of course, knew was let out by nobody less than Hillary Clinton. Andrei Soldatov and Irina Borogan, in their book, The Red Web, in the second edition, show with the public statement by Putin and Peskov, and the inside knowledge that this seems to have been what got Putin going, so that he insisted on interfering in the US elections in 2016. But in the Panama Papers, we see Putin's childhood friend, Sergei Roldugin, who knows nothing about finance, a cellist, that he had more than $2 billion offshore. And also 3 other childhood friends of Putin that hold at least $500 million in offshore accounts. So the Panama Papers expose the Putin people more than anybody else. And how do they get the money? So for example, Dugin got $259 million in consulting fees from Suleiman Karimov, one of the big Russian oligarchs who was sanctioned by the US in April last year. Or he gets $650 million in loans from a subsidiary of the Russian state bank in Cyprus, obviously not to be paid back. And the Guardian journalist Luke Harding pointed out that this state bank was used by Putin and his closest people like an ATM machine when they were traveling in Europe. And then also Putin takes care of his family. There are at least four cousins that are identified by Russian Forbes as holders of about $500 million each. So where is the money going? First of all, the requirements are 3. You need good rule of law, which precludes the whole of the former Soviet Union, China, and a lot of other countries, essentially just the developed West. You need anonymous companies, and you need deep financial markets. The 2 last criteria leave essentially 2 countries, the United Kingdom and the United States. Anonymous companies are not permitted on a large scale in Europe. So the money leaves traditionally through Cyprus. There are also other ways, and now it seems to go increasingly to the big black hole in the world economy, Dubai. And then it continues to British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, and then it goes to 2 places. Wilmington, Delaware, and it's not because it's an old Swedish colony, or to the United Kingdom. So in each place, about half a dozen shell companies are being constructed for seriously dirty money. So we come up to 20, 30 shell companies on top of one another. I've seen some of these chains, and they typically have 12 different jurisdictions, shell companies in many different jurisdictions, so that it becomes impossible to see. And then much of this is invested in real estate, which is safe but offers little return. If you take the US alone, the US Treasury says that there is $300 billion that is laundered in this country each year. This is a report from 2015, repeated last year. And about $100 billion out of this in real estate. The real estate was excluded in the Patriot Act, so this is not strictly illegal to launder money in real estate. But anonymous, it is. And something that people don't know is that the second biggest investor in US securities is a little place called Cayman Islands, which has invested far more in US securities than China, only less than Japan, namely more than $1.7 trillion. And this is essentially anonymous money. We have no idea where it comes from. My guess would be a couple of hundreds of billions from Russia, but we don't know. This is completely dark money. And you can notice now that when certain people are not sufficiently skillful, as in this Lev Parnas, Igor Fruman case, 1 million happens to go openly into Nevada, which is very unprofessional. Putin and his friends would have done it in a much more professional fashion. So let me then show you a few pictures, what this really looks like. Here we have a center of state power, the Security Council, with 12 members that meets about every 10th day. I think that this is the center of the power. This is the new Politburo. We don't write anything about it because we know nothing about it. We don't have inside information about it. And half of the members are generals and one is a lady. This looks very Soviet, doesn't it? But this doesn't look so Soviet. Here we have Igor Sechin of Rosneft to the left and Alexei Miller, CEO of Gazprom. What is outstanding with these people is that probably nobody has destroyed as much capital as these two men together. Alexei Miller, the happiest one, his company had a top market value in May 2008 of $369 billion. Today, it's down to about $80 billion. So he has successfully destroyed $290 billion. And he has been sitting there as a CEO since 2001. Why? Because market capitalization is not what Putin cares about. He cares about where the money goes. And Gazprom does not work for its shareholders, half of which is the Russian state, but it works for Putin's cronies that I will show later on. Igor Sechin here to the left, the most aggressive Russian corporate raider, who took over Yukos, who has taken over TNK BP, and destabilized the Russian economy with his wild speculation. He has probably destroyed $100 to $150 billion. So he's lagging behind. But this is what we are discussing. What you do for the state doesn't matter. This is a real kleptocracy. So what are they actually doing? Here we see Igor Sechin up to the left, and this is his yacht, Princess Olga, worth $150 million. And to the right, you can see his Princess Olga, his then wife, who has now, I'm sorry to say, eloped with an Italian racer driver. You can't get it all. And here we have Alexei Miller's alleged palace, Millerhof. This is what you get for $300 to $400 million on the outskirts of Moscow. Igor Sechin, after he has been abandoned by Olga, has decided to build a similar palace outside of Moscow for $350 million. And here we're coming finally to the cronies that I haven't named yet. Gennady Timchenko, the biggest. Russian Forbes put him at $20 billion. I would put him at substantially more, probably several times more, with offshore holdings. And he has Novatek, an independent gas producer, where he, of course, gets gas licenses as nobody else. Sibur, the biggest petrochemical company in Russia, that he bought cheaply from Gazprom, an oil trading company that he was forced to sell the day before he was sanctioned by the US Treasury, and then gas pipeline construction. So Novatek, Sibur, and pipeline construction is his big business. And this is a $300 million yacht instead. So here you can see that Timchenko is more important as a crony than Sechin. Here we have a second of the cronies, Arkady Rotenberg, Putin's oldest childhood friend that we know of. He and Putin did judo together at least since they were 12, and he's now the king of state orders. Russia is actually a database that shows each year who got how much of state procurement. And you can easily sum it up, and this is then being published in Forbes and Kommersant in Russian. And Arkady Rotenberg is primarily building gas pipelines, just like Timchenko, but he's also the person who has failed to build a highway between Saint Petersburg and Moscow during all these years. And he built much of the Sochi Olympics. Most recently has built a bridge over the Kerch Strait for $3.5 billion. So the Ukrainians are now happy that it's Rotenberg who has built it, presuming that it will collapse as so much else of what Rotenberg builds. And here we have Boris Rotenberg, who, like Timchenko, is a Finnish citizen. So Timchenko and Boris Rotenberg have not been sanctioned by the European Union, while both are sanctioned by the US. And these are the palaces of the brothers Rotenberg. You see they are very close to one another, facing one another in a pleasant family setting. And unfortunately, I don't have the prices of these palaces. And this is Yuri Kovalchuk, who's the real spider in Putin's web in two ways. Kovalchuk owns 20 out of Russia's 22 real television channels, and in particular Gazprom Media with NTV, which is very fond of Mike. And so this also shows how Putin runs the power. Putin doesn't trust the state. He wants television to be controlled by one of his most loyal friends, Yuri Kovalchuk, a name that you probably have not heard before. And he's also the person who sits on Bank Russia, which is the treasurer, you can say, of the Putin group. And here we have the finest palace on them all, which I think is quite tasteful. This was what broke Sergei Kolesnikov. He was involved in the financing of this. So therefore we have a number, $1 billion. That money was taken by 35% out of the medical equipment orders. And Putin has, of course, denied that it was built for him, but that's just one of the things that you're supposed to do. So where does this take us? I think that we should remember that organized crime, kleptocracy, is a major part of what Putin does. Kleptocracies, authoritarian kleptocracies rule many countries, most of the former Soviet Union, much of Africa, pretty much the whole of the Middle East. And what is typical of such countries? They hardly grow at all, because growth and welfare of the population is not an objective. And therefore, we should not expect political or economic reform. Either of them would destabilize this system. And we could expect increased domestic repression, but it's not inevitable. There are always dangers. Sensible dictators want to have some safety valve so that they can see what is going on, wants the opposition people to reveal themselves. So what I see as the dominant policy is small victorious wars, as the Tsarist Minister of Interior Vyacheslav von Plehve called it in 1904, just before he was assassinated. And that's what we have seen very successfully for Putin in Georgia in August 2008, and the annexation of Crimea in March 2014, which led to Putin getting 88% approval rating in the well-considered Levada Center polls. So I think that this is what we should look for. People talk about hybrid warfare. Putin's clearly aware of the limited economic resources and does the unexpected cleverly, but there are only so many small and victorious wars that you can pursue, and we are also seeing an increased acceptance of risk. So what should the West do? Just a few words. Maintain and reinforce sanctions, especially personal sanctions. Putin protested 5 times publicly against the US sanctions on his friends that I named here. In particular, he complained once that Gennady Timchenko's wife, who was getting medical treatment in Germany, poor Gennady Timchenko could not pay for it with his credit card because of the US sanctions. So Putin uttered the uncommon for him word that this is a violation of human rights, something that he normally does not. And the other is reveal all ultimate beneficiary owners. This is what we really need to get done. And happily, you might have noticed that yesterday, the US House of Representatives voted through with a big majority the Corporate Transparency Act of 2019, which means that all ultimate beneficiary owners of companies in the US will have to be named to FinCEN, the financial police of the US Treasury. I hope that this will pass through the Senate also. This would be an enormous step forward. The European Union has essentially done this already. And my big fear is that after Brexit, the United Kingdom will be the big black money center, which it already is, of the world, and that it will be very difficult to get at it. And a minor point is that strict anti-money laundering in Europe is needed, but the big thing is we need to know the ultimate beneficiary owners. And of course, the US needs a serious Russia policy and not this. Thank you.
Okay, Anders, thank you very much. Let me ask the first question. With your suspicion that there's a lot of Russian money parked in property in the United States and in London, and you talked about some measures, how much is that money at risk? I mean, if in fact you get disclosure of ultimate beneficiaries, is that something all of a sudden Putin says, hey, wait, this money could really be sanctioned and frozen quickly?
I think that is an enormous risk. And if you talk to really wealthy people from this part of the world, not only Russia, but other countries, I spend a lot of time in Ukraine, this is one of the big concerns, to make sure that our money is safe. And what you see then, in Russia, it's very clear that the elite is divided into 2 groups. The people who leave and the people who stay. For example, the metallurgy people, the security people are staying. Most of the really rich try to leave and get their money safe. But what the Russians are doing, I've actually done a couple of reports for the Atlantic Council of it, is that the Russians are using the foreign judiciary to go after people, in particular with red notices. So they have, somebody has left Russia, and there are some, and they then construe a financial case against the person and go after them with red notices. Bill Browder has very much publicized it with his book, Red Notice, which I think is a very good public service. But this is a big thing. The Interpol red notices are produced now in tens of thousands. Who produces them? Russia, China, Turkey, and believe it or not, Tajikistan, and the Gulf states. So Tajikistan recently registered 2,500 red notices. So they get beaten in both at home and abroad. All the time you have about 200,000 Russian businessmen sitting in pre-trial detention. I was recently in Poland and testified to the benefit of a Russian businessman who had been arrested in Poland on a red notice in February, and he got only out in September. There's nothing in it. And he was only vice president of a bank that the authorities had stolen. And if they've stolen, then somebody must be responsible and accountable. So then they pick up somebody and punish them. The other 7 vice presidents of this bank had been arrested in Moscow. 5 of them have been sitting in pre-trial detention now for 3 years and are still sitting. While the 2 owners, they managed to get out in time, and they have and they live in this country. But Russians with a lot of money are in big trouble, regardless of what side they are on politically. And I talked with one of the very wealthy oligarchs who happens to be Jewish, and he said when we discussed this, and said, well, we have been Jews all our life. Now we are Russians abroad, so we have some habit.
Okay. Here.
I wonder if you could say a word about the domestic Russian market, given everything that you described. What is the share of this kleptocratic economy in the larger context of the Russian domestic market? Why am I asking this? Because when we go to Russia, especially to the large cities, we see tremendous growth there in small businesses, mid-sized businesses, that are not necessarily related to these ones. What is their share in the other Russian economy, the ones that most Russians make their living of, and not just siphoning money overseas?
20 to 30%. 20 to 30%. So how one can say, put it like this, is about half the Russian economy is nationalized. So that's out. And then you have perhaps 20%, which is the big companies that are private still. Here you have, for example, Sibur, Novatek, which are very well managed companies. You have all the big metallurgical companies. And then you have a limited sector, which think, for example, of a big retail chains, which look exactly the same as in the US, only that they have different names and use the same logistical systems. And or take the mobile phone companies, 3 highly competitive mobile phone companies that keep the prices much lower than here. So therefore it's relatively easy to say 20-30% is what we are seeing as a positive.
Frank.
So Anders, I don't understand Putin's motive for stripping assets and putting it in American real estate. I mean, normally you launder money that way because the source of the money is a criminal activity like narco trafficking, but you actually want to spend the money, right? And so you need to wait to get it out of the country so you can buy your yacht or your house in Beverly Hills or whatever. But Putin's not going to do that, right? I mean, he's not going to leave Russia. He can't enjoy the yacht, cruising around the Mediterranean. So why take, potentially productive asset and put it in low return real estate? I mean, so I can understand why an oligarch would want to do that, but why would Putin want to do that?
Yeah, this is a good question that I've been thinking a lot about. And therefore, I ask people who are very wealthy, and they are highly competitive. First of all, they want to be most wealthy. And if you're not most wealthy, then you are not the president. And I could not understand, for example, Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine. He and his crowd probably stole $40 billion in the course of 4 years. And probably the family, in a narrow sense, $12 billion. And particularly, they went after Akhmetov and Firtash, the two biggest oligarchs that were the closest to them. And in this way, it was Firtash and Akhmetov who took out Yanukovych. And probably they had taken about half of their wealth from Akhmetov and Firtash. And then they are no longer loyal. But the greed, when you come up to this, people want to be the richest. And when it comes to Putin, he wants to be most powerful. If he doesn't have more money than all the others, he's not the most powerful. He's not respected. When Navalny put out his film about Dmitry Medvedev, where he shows how Medvedev, as prime minister, had got $1.2 billion in bribes from Michelson and Alisher Usmanov in particular. And he has 6 nice estates and 2 vineyards, but then he has 2 yachts. And then people in the higher elite say, what a shame that our prime minister has such small yachts. And here you could see, in particular when it comes to yachts and palaces, you have to have the biggest. So Putin today has, according to Leonid Martinyuk and Boris Nemtsov, 25 palaces. This is what you need if you want to display power. So it's not a question of enjoying it. And also, they show that Putin has a collection of watches worth at least $600,000. I mean, this is small money in comparison, but it's the preoccupation with the status things. And in particular, when it comes to the yachts, Roman Abramovich has 4 of these giant yachts worth about $300 million each in order to show that he's a big person. And he has a Boeing 767 painted in gold so that you won't mistake him for somebody else. And this is how they do it. And Alisher Usmanov, who's one of the very richest in Russia, he had a yacht now for $600 million, which was the biggest of all the Russian yachts. And the point is that people keep count of it, and it's being reported in the media. Not in the official media, but on the internet. And then, poor thing, he thought that he would be sanctioned by the US, so he sold his yacht to whom? MBS, Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, where they have the same culture. So people who really have a lot, they want to show that they are the biggest. You can look on the same way on the US billionaires. If you take Sheldon Adelson or the Koch brothers, it is very much to not to utilize the money, but to make sure that they have the most. And since they can't show the money, then they show the palaces and the yachts instead. So yacht, notice among the big Ukrainians, it's very important how long your yacht is.
Mike?
So thanks for being here, Anders. I don't have time to read many books, but I've read this book, and I highly encourage you all to buy this book. It's being sold over there, because if you don't buy it, then these kind of books don't get written. So I have lots of questions. I'm just going to ask one, and then if I get a chance to get on your list again, I want to take another bite at the apple. But the first one, because we're on yachts, I actually met Princess Olga one time. And it was actually quite an elaborate event. It was the Saint Petersburg Economic Forum. It's just to illustrate the question I have. Igor Sechin was there. All the oligarchs host their private parties, and he had rented out the entire Hermitage for the evening for his guests, and I was the U.S. ambassador, so you had the entire place to yourself. That was the first time I met Olga. Olga seemed to know a lot about yachts, a lot about St. Bart's, I remember, and it was striking to me, given how different they are in age and background and experience, that we wondered later that evening when, if Mr. Sechin's money and his property rights are ever endangered, she's not going to stick around very long. And lo and behold, he got on the sanctions list. He probably can't go to St. Bart's anymore. And I don't know causation or correlation about the story you told about her new boyfriend, but that made me think about what happens when their property rights are less secure. And in particular, I'm going to make a wild prediction that Putin will not rule Russia forever. What happens to all these property rights that are tied to him? I know it's an impossible question to answer, but I'm curious what happens, just the nature of property rights in that post-Putin era.
Good question. The obvious answer is that we don't know, that there will be many,
more than
many conflicts about it. But for example, the traditional thing was that keep the money in Switzerland. That Haile Selassie and the Jews under the Holocaust, they took the money to Switzerland. What we later learned, this Stuart Eisenstadt's investigation, was that much of this money was taken over by the banks. And I give you a contrary example. It is the Estonians, when they were occupied by the Soviets, they managed to take their gold reserves abroad. They took them to 3 countries, Sweden, Britain, and Switzerland. And what happened? Sweden sent the gold reserves of Estonia to Moscow. Britain used them for their national purposes. And the Swiss kept the money. They kept the gold reserve. And both Britain and Sweden then restituted the gold to Estonia after. But it's just one of these clear examples. Money disappears. And gold is clearer. And if you think of it, stocks lose the value in one way or the other. They are being sorted out. So the fundamental lesson is that you are likely to lose it.
Alice?
Thank you. Thanks for this great talk. My question is about objectives at the top for Putin's inner circle. According to this argument, it sounds like money and having the longest yacht and these kind of forms of one-upmanship are the only things that motivate these people in Putin's inner circle and in the Kremlin. But we do see a lot that has to do with reconstituting Russia as a great power in the world, making it a major player in this new global order, being a disruptive force, and so on. So I'm curious your thoughts about whether any of these objectives also play a role in decision-making at the top, or whether it's purely financial and kleptocratic.
Well, if you take the top circles, we have 3 circles. One is the state. And if you take the state concretely, it is the 3 last heads of the FSB, Sergei Ivanov, Nikolai Patrushev, and Alexander Bortnikov. These people are no Puritans, but they are not real businessmen. The sons have probably got $500 million or so by becoming vice presidents of the big state companies early on and doing various kinds of business, but they are not. And if you move in those circles of people, you hear you hear comments like, Mike, you must have heard this a lot. you can't imagine how corrupt they are. And the attitude is, we of course steal a little, but they take it. And so I can imagine that this group of FSB people really are really irritated with the Rothenbergs, Timchenko, and Kovalchuk, and you have a lot of rivalry between. Sechin is an extremely ambitious guy. He wants to be biggest and best in everything. And so you had a lot of rivalry that drives them. But then great power, my general attitude is that great power is not important. You would do something completely different. But having said that, I think it's very important for the image. So it's in order to maintain power, Putin needs to show that he's making Russia great again. Well, approximately like Trump, if you excuse me. So it's not a question if it's really happening, but that it looks as if it's happening. So Putin really reveled in the annexation of Crimea, which was generally popular, because Crimea to Russians is the Soviet holiday paradise lost. Crimea is much more attractive than Sochi. And therefore, people had a longing for it. But it was at that, so to say, nostalgic level, not a fundamental level. And you can see Putin, apart from Crimea, has not incorporated something. He's not serious as a neo-imperialist. And I don't see him as a neo-imperialist. But it's much more this Russian attitude after the Crimean War in the 1860s, that Russia wanted to be at every table, wanted to be not the ruler, but the kingmaker, the dominant mediator, approximately what we are seeing now in Syria, that Russia does not want to hold it. Is very careful not to maximize let the costs run away. So the short answer, it's important for image making.
Norm?
That was my question.
Okay. Gentleman in the back there. Yeah.
Your comments raised a question about the pertinence of the word kleptocracy. For me, that word implies I want money for its own sake. What I'm hearing for you is increasingly that people want money for the sake of status, for yachts, for other kinds of things that represent some kind of position in a social hierarchy. And I'm wondering if a better title might be The Path from Market Economy to Statusocracy.
Well, people would not know what it is. I'll tell you something else. It's really a market economy. It's my, it's my publisher who wanted to have from market economy, since I had it in the previous, in my 95 book. How Russia became a market economy. But it is a market economy. But it's not, it's a very crony capitalism. So the emphasis that I want to have is that property rights are not safe. And you get a certain behavior when property rights are not safe. I was in Hungary the first time in, let's see, long ago, 1976. And that was during the Gulash communism happy days. There were gypsy bands in every decent restaurant. And I was just amazed to see how people were throwing large amounts of banknotes at the gypsy orchestras. And you get then the sense that this must be a very wealthy society. While studying a little bit more of economics, I understood that this is because property rights are not safe. So people can't invest their money anyhow. So why not throw it away? Then at least you have some fun with the money. So part of this is that people have a lot of conspicuous consumption. to talk with Torsten Veblen, that they want to show that they have all this money. At the same time, they're careful that they don't show everybody. They only want to show the relevant people that they have a lot of money, so that they don't get into trouble.
And you remind me of that famous joke about the ties, right? Where someone goes, "I bought this tie down at this store for $175," and the guy says, "You fool, you could have gotten the same tie around the block for $225. It's about, well,
yeah.
Yeah, yes.
I presume that airing of these sort of things in the press or on television is not a common effect in Russia. But what about social media? Is there a heavy-handed censorship of it to the point where that also cannot bring this up for air?
I would probably say something that surprises you. It's much more difficult to publish this in English than in Russian or Ukrainian. Because in Russia and Ukraine, libel is not a serious issue. While in the US and the UK, in the English language, it's a very serious issue. It's much easier to publish things in German or Swedish than in English. So I could not publish this book in England.
Well, I'm asking about not you and all.
Yeah, no, but
I'm not talking about people interacting with one another on social media.
You can find it all on the Russian internet. The point is rather to figure out what is true and what is not true. So I'm very, very cautious sticking to the good publication, via the most Kommersant, Forbes primarily. And there are lots of unreliable media around, but you hardly see a story in English today about oligarchs, because if there is one negative word about an oligarch, you can't publish it in English. So the libel law and the freedom of the media is actually much greater problem here. It's worse in Britain, but also in the US. It's a very serious problem. And everything that deals with oligarchs has to be seriously checked. And the books like Chrystia Freeland's Sale of a Century and David Hoffman's of the Oligarchs from 2000 and 2002, if I remember rightly, could not be published today. Because serious Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs, they have lawyers in Washington with retainers of $1 million a year that check everything that is written about their clients.
I would like to continue the question about Syria. If Syria is going to become cost more for Russia, for Putin, I am curious what is going to happen and how Russia and Iran would function in Syria, and like, is a question mark for me. Can you?
Yeah, let me answer. This is not my area, but I do look up on the defense economy. Russia's defense expenditure has increased from 3.3% of GDP in 2008 to 5.3% of GDP now, and which is a substantial increase of 2% of GDP. But Russia is not increasing it above that, which they reached in 2016, and just keeping it at that level. There might be some trickery because the unaccounted for section in the Russian state budget is increasing. So it might be inaccurate, but the numbers I use is from the Stockholm Institute for Peace, in Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. So Putin is careful with his expenditures. He does not let them go too far. So my generic answer to your question would be that Putin will not allow the cost to become too big. Yeah, why not? He has not made any strict commitment, so he is very careful to maintain his freedom, but it's not my area. I'm not doing military strategy.
Thank you. So you've talked about how wealth is a great asset here, particularly to maintaining power. Where do you think that tipping point is where this extreme wealth can become a liability in terms of maintaining power? And I think this might go to the question of if people in the country are aware of these palaces and these yachts and this lifestyle through social media or other ways that circumvent state-controlled media. I mean, at what point does, where is sort of Putin's golden toilet?
Of course, he has a golden toilet and palace. We have even photos on it. But this is the critical question. And Russia's standard of living is falling steadily. During the last 5 years, the real disposable incomes of the population have fallen by a total of 13%. So 2.5% a year. This is a miserable performance, and it's continuing. So what I'm looking for very carefully is the kind of protest, and lots of other people are looking. What we are seeing now is that protests are limited but increasing. The main issue of protest now is poisonous dumps. 4 of these crooks have taken care of the garbage collection in Moscow and much of Russia. The garbage collection in many places is highly criminalized. And the crime here is that they are supposed to recycle half of it, and they don't. Instead, they dump it. So from Moscow now, they are taking garbage to Arkhangelsk Oblast, up in the north. And people in Arkhangelsk are then protesting against it, and it's happening in other. So we have these protests. The person who's really done a lot to develop this is Alexei Navalny with his anti-corruption foundation. And what they are doing now is that they are picking up on all protests. They say that we want to be the opposition party. And we don't care what people are protesting about. We are caring that people get support in their protests. When they stand up for rule of law and for democracy and freedom without any further ideology. You can say that this is generally liberal, yes, but it's not specified in any way with an economic or political program. So Leonid Volkov, who I talked to a few months ago, the campaign manager of Navalny, he said that previously we operated in 85 regions when we pursued our corruption campaigns. Now we operate in 45 regions, but it's much more difficult because each region has their own problem. And we are just telling them which are the good techniques to develop it. So this is the latent organization, but basically you never know when you come to the tipping point. But one thing that it should happen, and of course, typically in this situation, you have 3 things. 1, people are unhappy. Yes, they're unhappy, but not that unhappy. People divide in the law enforcement, and here we can see that there's a strict divisions between FSB on the one hand and most of the other law enforcement on the other. And then the third, if there is any disaster in foreign policy. Since Russian TV today doesn't report very much about what is happening inside the country. We are coming to a situation as in the 1980s under the old regime, that they report mainly about foreign policy, and then foreign policy failures become also much more important, as happened with Afghanistan.
Someone in the back.
I see somebody in the corner.
Well, my question was actually very much the same, so maybe duplication. But do you belong to the school of thought, according to which Putin is president for life, because it's simply going to be too dangerous for him to cease to be president? And if so, are we looking at a period? I mean, he's in his mid-60s, I believe, apparently very fit. He could be there for another 20 years. So, apologies if I'm repeating the previous question, but how do you see, looking into your economic crystal ball, this kind of economy surviving, performing, changing, if we're looking at a period of 20 years, during which Putin is going to be there, absent the kind of revolt that you've, a popular revolt that you've referred to?
Yeah, yeah, understand me very well. Of course, I think that Putin will stay for life. There's no sign that he's looking for any successor. Or he was clearly not happy with the Medvedev experience. And as I learned from Mike, we co-authored a book about the Orange Revolution. Regimes need some source of legitimacy. There's no party, there's no ideology, and there's no monarchy. So there's nothing really to hang it on. So this is a strict personal authoritarian.
Opinion polls.
Yeah, opinion polls are important. For personal authoritarianism, opinion polls are important. I think that Dan Treisman has elaborated quite well on it, that Putin has more power when he's more popular. You know, so that it does matter. But basically, I don't see that there is anything else. My sense in Russia now is that it's like in the mid-80s. People think that it will be the same forever, and you can see that this is a completely petrified system politically. Economically, of course, it's so much more alive. And my friends are still there. Many have left. They have gone into internal exile. That is, that they're entertaining themselves with art and theater, exactly as it was in the 1980s. Well, their job, that's just something that you do in order to earn a living. It's not something that you're trying to accomplish something with. Different with a businessman, but they are not all that many.
Back here? Yeah.
I'm from Ukraine. I study here within Ukrainian Conversion Leaders Program, and as you can assume, you told about those little victorious wars. One of these little victorious wars is right now happening in Ukraine, and as you can assume, we're very concerned about where the next little victorious war is going to be. Because looking at Russian news now, if you just turn on TV and look a little bit, listen to Russian news, there's only Ukraine and USA. And both are red and so on and so on. So what's your opinion? What is it going to be the next little victorious war? Where?
I don't see any good prospects for it. And the war in eastern Ukraine, I would not call it neither small nor victorious. And we can see also that Putin has not settled for anything. It reminds me a bit of a situation in Germany after the war, that it was only in the summer of 1952 that Stalin decided to Sovietize East Germany. So he didn't quite manage to get it properly done before he died. But Crimea is administratively a proper Russian province. Donbass is a lawless hellhole where half the population, occupied Donbass, where half the population has fled, and essentially it's only pensioners and children and crooks that are left. So this is it doesn't look on the surface as Putin has any clear idea. And while it seems that he wants to discuss what to do about it. So I think that Ukraine showed that it was far too costly for Putin, and Putin is not prepared to take on such big financial expenditures. And I think that the Western sanctions that probably cost 1.5% of the GDP in economic growth for Russia each year were a big and a good deterrent, but we didn't see that something would happen in Syria. We didn't see that it would, Crimean annexation was underway. Now we have Russian troops in the various places in Africa. I don't think that this is popular at all, or we know that it's not at all popular. The Syrian military engagement is not popular in Russia, while I think that it gives a certain satisfaction that Russia is a big power again, unlike the US in Syria. And so that kind of satisfaction might have some significance, but I dare not say. Putin is very clever in these regards, but I can't see what would make sense now.
Right?
I don't want to jump the queue.
Okay,
There's others.
Okay.
I did just have one question. Actually, it was in a similar vein to the previous question about less secure property rights. I was curious, like in light of the passing of the House bill yesterday, should something like that actually come into law, what are the implications of that more strictly from a political stability point of view, as well as from a international relations perspective with the West? Is that something that you see being interpreted as a political affront to kleptocracies? Is that something that's ultimately going to be, deemed a provocation, and we're going to get anti-adoption bans or something like that? What are the political implications?
Very good question, worth digging further into it, something worth writing about. My immediate observation is that when you see people who find that the property is in danger, they only think about that. They don't start war, they run to the lawyers to figure out how they can sort out the situation. So what you get is not collective action, but individual action. I want to save my property. So that's the first observation. Second observation is that this has actually, with geographic target orders, already happened since, I think it's 2 or 3 years now, that the US Treasury has imposed this FinCEN. And the consequence, and this is that the title companies now have to say in large parts of the country, in particular New York and southern Florida, which are the big money laundering areas, they must give the name of the ultimate beneficiary owner of the company that is buying property. And this has sharply reduced the sales of the upscale property. I heard that in Miami in 1 year, the property top line real estate prices fell by 10%. And all over the country now, people are afraid of buying with anonymous companies, LLCs. So I think that this is relatively easy to get. And if you look around the world, there are very few places you can go with dirty money. So in the Caribbean, most of the islands have had serious financial crises after 2008, and many are still in financial crisis. So it's really only British Virgin Islands and Cayman Islands that are open and have substantial financial sectors. Bermuda, for example, is very strict. You could see the Paradise Papers when they came up. They were much more about US companies than about other kinds of companies. And it's very focused on insurance. Bahamas is fund managers in a limited scale. And then for the rest, there is very little. So Cyprus is cleaning up. Malta will clean up. They have now got a very bad review of Moneyball, which is attached to the Council of Europe. So the only big black hole that remains is Dubai. And then Singapore is a bit, but it's not much. It's very difficult to invest dirty money. So what happens then is that you lose it in one way or the other. And given that these are massive fortunes that have come up in a short time, they also disappear. Actually, going back to your question before, Mike, Alexis Soviets, who was first deputy prime minister in Russia and was sacked in June '96, he was considered to be a multi-billionaire and controlling a lot of the metallurgical industry in Russia. And he had always denied that that was the case. And it's Julia Latinina who pointed out that after he was no longer in the government, it turned out that he didn't really own anything, that all of this was lost because it belonged to the brothers Rubin in London, and it belonged to the brothers Chernoy, who then moved to Israel. So it's very difficult to secure property rights, and Americans think that property rights are sort of a God-given. Europeans after World War II doesn't believe that. They know that money comes and goes, and the big fortunes also.
I guess what I was getting at more is, do you see countries like Russia using the power of the state in order to try to protect these for the few? Like if the oligarchs that you mentioned, whose money is ultimately at risk, do you see using the power of the state in Russia to ultimately try to enforce that? I guess mostly to try to serve and protect those for the few as opposed to just a broader coalition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but it's a difficult question. So where you can see when it comes to sanctions, I would suggest that Roman Abramovich and Alisher Usmanov are too well connected in this country to be sanctioned. And Deripaska was not sufficiently well connected in this country, so he was sanctioned. And when it came to Rusal, it turned out that the Rusal, Russian aluminum, with 6% of aluminum production, was too big to sanction. So it caused a lot of problem on the market. Another example, I was surprised that gas, Deripaska's big car factory in Nizhny Novgorod escaped sanction after first having been sanctioned by the US Treasury. So I dug into it, and it turned out that he had a joint venture with Volkswagen there. And the Russian state then told Volkswagen, it's better that you buy the whole company. And Volkswagen did not want to do that, nor did they want to just abandon their investment. So then Volkswagen asked the US Treasury, please, can you, or the Russian, German government, can you ease the sanctions on the gas, because we don't want to spend more money in Russia, which you would be forcing us to do, because we're not going to throw that money away. And then the US Treasury sensibly eased the sanctions. So this is not exactly what you're asking about, but it's illustrating how the Russian state is getting involved. And we are also seeing, in particular in the Mueller investigation, I was very interested in seeing how Piotr Aven of Alpha Bank says that he meets with Putin once a quarter to discuss essentially US policy. So that Putin is tying the oligarchs closer to him. He's asking them to do more services now, and they are getting into a more difficult situation. Most of the truly wealthy in Russia want to disappear quickly from Russia, and most of them do so. rather successfully. But quite a lot of them, for example, Ahmed Bilalov was arrested, I think yesterday in Miami, who's on a Russian red notice. This is something that should not happen in any Western country.
I think I take a woman here and then Mike.
I have a question about state capture. So do you think Putin has a fear that there's going to be a repeat of state capture like the state capture, the oligarchy did state capture in 1990s and the Åslund, they're going to repeat again under his administration if he relies so heavily on those oligarchies and their network and support? What are some of the key strategies of Putin in order to maintain absolute power in his rule?
I don't think that Putin is the least afraid of this. I know several of his characters, and the more money they get, the more cowardly they become politically. So they are not, because think of it, you have $10 billion. You say a negative word about Putin, that costs you a lot. While you and I can say negative words about Putin now, it doesn't cost us really anything, or at least not much. But if we have $10 billion, it could cost us $9 billion. We can see how, for example, the owner of System and MTS, Yushchenkov, all of a sudden lost $9 billion because he got into a fight. And with Igor Sechin, and he did not have anybody to defend them. So the bigger you become, the more vulnerable you become. That's the irony.
Last question.
One more question.
Last question.
I'll be brief. So, Anders, tell us, what is the survival strategy or not? You've alluded to it, but I'm curious about the people you worked with in the 90s, people that seem to believe in markets and were part of the market reformers. You know, I'm thinking about guys like Chubais or Greff, who are now working with state companies, or just economists that you knew back then. What are they doing in this era of crony capitalism?
Well, I mean, Diego Gaidar, whom we knew very well, basically drank himself to death and died of a heart attack early because there was not much to do. Many of them, not to be mentioned here, have essentially gone into internal exile. And that they don't want to take any political risks. Chubais and Greff are really singular individuals. And I don't think that Alexei Kudrin, for example, is happy that he did not particularly want to become head of the auditing chamber. And he sort of understood that this was the last option that Putin would give him. But Putin has been very clever in this, that he allows people to decline gradually. He doesn't sack them outright, but he offers them, gives them offers that they can't refuse. And they understand that if I don't take this, then I would get nothing. And therefore they take that offer. So I think that in this personnel policy, he's very clever. And most of the money they have disappeared quietly abroad, and the lesson I think everybody has drawn is that the less noise you make, the better. So if you take, for example, Boris Mintz, who was financing the Gaida Foundation, he then got into trouble with his real estate, and while others, people not to be mentioned because they do not want to be mentioned, they quietly disappeared with the money abroad. So I see three kinds of behavior. We have particularly older people like Lilia Shevtsova, Leonid Gozman, They are becoming only more liberal with age because they don't have anything to risk any longer. And the regime does not really go after people in the 60s and 70s, people who go for internal immigration, or people who immigrate with wealth. And then you have a few people like Chubais and Greff who actually survive in high positions, but then have to make very considerable concessions. And of course, the word systemic liberals is hardly used any longer because they are just seen as part of a regime.
Great. Okay, well, please join me in thanking Anders for this account.